Sometimes a single moment changes everything we thought we knew about love and courage. In the dusty streets of Iron Creek, a wedding day was about to become something far more dangerous. Evelyn Ashford stood in her finest dress, promised to a man she didn't love, watching as her wealthy fiancé humiliated a poor cowboy named Cole Mercer in front of the entire town. The insult cut deep, but what happened next shocked everyone. This beautiful socialite, trapped in a gilded cage of family expectations, threw down a challenge that would shake the very foundation of their world. If Cole could break her wild stallion, a horse so fierce no man had ever stayed on its back, she would walk away from her arranged marriage. The whole town gathered to watch, but none of them knew the real stakes. Would this desperate gamble free two hearts, or destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Iron Creek's main street, where the scent of fresh bread from Martha's bakery mingled with the dust kicked up by the early freight wagons. It was 1887, and the railroad had brought prosperity to this once sleepy valley nestled between the Sierra Nevada foothills. Victorian houses with gingerbread trim now stood alongside the original log cabins, a testament to how quickly fortunes could change in the American West. Cole Mercer adjusted his father's worn silver spurs as he prepared for another day's work at the Ashford Ranch. These spurs had crossed 3 states and weathered countless storms, their once bright surface now dulled by years of honest labor. They were all Cole had left of his father, who died when a spooked horse threw him 5 years back. Every morning, Cole fastened them to his boots, with the same reverence other men reserved for prayer. Knowing they carried more than just memories, they carried the weight of a family's dignity. At 26, Cole had the kind of weathered face that spoke of early mornings and hard work. His hands, calloused from rope and leather, told the story of a man who'd learned that respect wasn't given. It was earned one honest day at a time. He'd been working the Ashford land for 3 years now, ever since drifting into Iron Creek with nothing but his father's spurs and a horse that had seen better days. The Ashford estate sat on a hill overlooking the town like a crown jewel, its white columns and wraparound porches speaking of old money and Eastern refinement. Harold Ashford had built his fortune in banking before the war, then invested wisely in railroads and cattle. His daughter Evelyn had grown up in this world of afternoon teas and finishing school manners, but those who looked closely could see something restless in her green eyes, as if she were always searching for horizons beyond her gilded cage. Evelyn had returned from 3 years at a ladies' academy in San Francisco just 6 months ago, and the change in her had been the subject of much town gossip. Where once she'd been quietly compliant, now she asked questions that made her father's business associates shift uncomfortably in their chairs. She'd been caught reading books on women's suffrage, and last month she'd scandalized the church ladies by suggesting that perhaps women should have more say in choosing their own destinies. Her engagement to Barrett Thornfield had been arranged before she'd even returned from school. Barrett owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a man of 35 who wore his wealth like a badge and his cruelty like a comfortable old coat. He had the kind of sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't consistently arranged in expressions of contempt. His hands were soft from never having worked a day in honest labor, and his eyes held the coldness of a man who saw everything and everyone as commodities to be bought or sold. The engagement had been announced at the spring social, with Harold Ashford beaming as he spoke of uniting 2 great ranching families. Barrett had smiled and shaken hands, while Evelyn stood beside him like a beautiful statue, her smile never reaching her eyes. The wedding was set for early autumn, when the cottonwoods would turn gold and the air would carry the promise of harvest. But Evelyn had other ideas, though she'd kept them buried deep. She'd spent her mornings riding the ranch boundaries, always alone, always thinking. It was during these rides that she'd first noticed Cole Mercer working with the difficult horses that other hands wouldn't touch. There was something in the way he moved, the way he spoke to the animals with quiet respect rather than dominance, that caught her attention. Cole had noticed her too, though he'd been careful never to let it show. A man in his position couldn't afford to even glance too long at Harold Ashford's daughter. He'd learned early that the world was divided into those who owned and those who worked, and crossing that line was a fool's errand that led to nothing but heartache. The other ranch hands respected Cole for his skill and his steady nature. He could gentle the most stubborn horse and mend a fence that would hold through the worst winter storm. But they also knew he was different from them. He read books when he thought no one was looking, and sometimes they'd catch him staring off toward the mountains with an expression that suggested he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. Barrett Thornfield had noticed this about Cole too, and it irritated him in ways he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the way Cole carried himself with quiet dignity despite his threadbare clothes, or the way the other hands looked to him for guidance, even though Barrett technically outranked him in every social measure that mattered. Whatever it was, Barrett had been looking for an opportunity to put the young cowboy in his place. The opportunity came on the morning of what was supposed to be Evelyn and Barrett's wedding day. The entire town had gathered in their finest clothes, the women in silk and the men in their best Sunday suits. Even the children had been scrubbed clean and warned to mind their manners. The church bells were ringing, and Martha had baked 3 dozen pies for the celebration afterward. Barrett had arrived early, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Cole made in 6 months. He was holding court with the other prominent men, discussing cattle prices and railroad schedules, when he spotted Cole leading a horse to the water trough. The cowboy's clothes were clean but obviously patched, and his boots, though well-maintained, showed the kind of wear that came from years of hard use. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Barrett said loudly enough for half the assembled crowd to hear. "I didn't realize we were allowing the hired help to attend society weddings." Cole paused in his work but didn't turn around. He'd dealt with men like Barrett before, and he knew that rising to the bait would only give them what they wanted. But Barrett wasn't finished. "Tell me, Mercer," Barrett continued, his voice carrying across the churchyard, "do you even own a decent pair of pants, or did you borrow those from a scarecrow?" The crowd had fallen silent, sensing the tension. Even the children stopped their playing to watch. Evelyn, who had been greeting guests with her father, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment not for herself, but for the cruelty being displayed in what should have been a moment of celebration. Cole finally turned, his face calm but his knuckles white, where he gripped the horse's lead rope. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thornfield. Didn't mean to interrupt your celebration." "Your job?" Barrett laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the morning air. "Your job is to know your place, and your place isn't among decent folk. Why don't you run along back to the stables where you belong?" It was then that Evelyn stepped forward, her white silk wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves. Her father reached for her arm, sensing trouble, but she moved too quickly for him to stop her. The crowd held its breath as she approached the two men, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded everyone present that she was Harold Ashford's daughter and not to be underestimated. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the churchyard, "I wonder if you might be interested in a small wager." The silence that followed Evelyn's words was so complete that even the church bells seemed to pause in their ringing. Every eye was fixed on the young woman in white silk who had just stepped between her fiancé and a cowboy he'd been publicly humiliating. Barrett's face had gone from amused superiority to something much darker. "Evelyn, what are you doing?" Barrett's voice carried a warning that made several people step back instinctively. But Evelyn's attention was focused entirely on Cole, whose weathered face showed both confusion and wariness. She could see the way his shoulders had tensed, the way his free hand had moved unconsciously toward his hat, brim, in a gesture of respect he couldn't quite suppress, even in this moment of uncertainty. "I have a horse." Evelyn continued, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. A stallion that no man has ever been able to ride. He's been on our ranch for 2 years now, eating our hay and taking up space in our best pasture because everyone who's tried to break him has failed. Harold Ashford pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. Evelyn, this is neither the time nor the place for such nonsense. We have a wedding to conduct. Do we, Father? Evelyn turned to look at him, and for the first time in years, Harold saw not his compliant daughter, but the spirited child who had once climbed to the top of the church steeple on a dare. Because I'm beginning to think that before I pledge my life to anyone, I should know exactly what kind of man he is. Barrett stepped closer to Evelyn, his voice low but carrying to the crowd nonetheless. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and of me. Get control of yourself immediately. It was the tone more than the words that sealed Barrett's fate. It was the voice of a man who expected absolute obedience, who saw his future wife as nothing more than another possession to be managed. Evelyn had heard her father use that same tone with the servants, and the realization that Barrett intended to treat her the same way crystallized something that had been building in her heart for months. The horse's name is Thunder, she said, turning back to Cole and speaking louder now, ensuring that every person present could hear her clearly. He's a black stallion, 16 hands high, with a spirit that's never been broken. Some say he's cursed, others say he's just too proud to submit to any man. Cole found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. Miss Ashford, I don't understand what you're asking of me. I'm asking if you think you could ride him, Evelyn said, and now her eyes were blazing with something that made Barrett take a step back. If you think you have what it takes to accomplish something that dozens of other men have failed to do. Evelyn, stop this immediately, Harold commanded, but his daughter wasn't listening to him anymore. And if you can, she continued, never taking her eyes off Cole's face, if you can stay on Thunder's back for a full minute while he does his worst, then I'll call off this wedding and reconsider whether Barrett Thornfield is the kind of man I want to spend my life with. The crowd erupted in gasps and excited whispers. Mrs. Henderson from the general store actually fanned herself, as if she might faint. The men began talking in low, urgent tones about odds and possibilities, while their wives exchanged looks that said they'd have enough gossip to last them through the next 3 church socials. Barrett's face had gone from red to pale and back to red again. You can't be serious. You would stake our entire future on some ridiculous display of what? Evelyn challenged him. Of courage? Of skill? Of the kind of man who treats even a wild animal with respect instead of cruelty? Cole stepped forward, and for the first time since this strange confrontation had begun, he addressed Barrett directly. Mr. Thornfield, sir, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I never intended. You never intended anything, because you're nothing, Barrett snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. You're a saddle tramp with empty pockets and holes in your boots, and you'll always be nothing. And now you have the audacity to let this woman make a fool of herself. Over you? It was the contempt in Barrett's voice when he said, "This woman," referring to his own intended bride, that finally pushed Cole past his natural caution about crossing social boundaries. Miss Ashford isn't making a fool of herself, Cole said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the stunned silence. She's showing more courage than any of us. Well, Barrett's hand moved toward the pistol he wore at his hip, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by several of the men in the crowd. Old Pete McKinnon, who'd fought in the war and knew trouble when he saw it, stepped closer to his own rifle. You want to know what I think about your challenge, Mercer? Barrett's voice was dangerous now, all pretense of civility abandoned. I think you'll end up in the dirt like every other fool who's tried to ride that devil horse, and then maybe you'll remember your place in this town. Cole looked at Barrett for a long moment, then turned to Evelyn. What he saw in her face, hope, defiance, and something that might have been desperation, made his decision for him. Miss Ashford, he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'd be honored to accept your challenge." The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Some cheered, others protested, and more than a few began placing hasty bets. Through it all, Evelyn stood perfectly still in her wedding dress, watching Cole's face with an expression that made Barrett realize for the first time that he might actually lose her. Harold Ashford grabbed his daughter's arm, his voice low and furious. "Evelyn, if you go through with this madness, there will be consequences. Barrett is a powerful man, and you are my daughter. Think about what you're doing." Evelyn looked at her father with eyes that held 22 years of pent-up rebellion. "I am thinking, Father, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking about what I want, instead of what everyone else expects of me." Barrett straightened his coat and forced his voice back to its usual controlled tone, though the effort was visible. "Fine. If you want this circus, you'll have it. But when your cowboy hero is lying broken in the dirt, don't expect me to pretend this never happened." Cole stepped forward, addressing the crowd that had gathered around them. "When do you want this to happen?" "Now," Evelyn said immediately, "before anyone has time to change their mind or come up with reasons why it can't be done." "Evelyn," Harold started to protest again, but she cut him off. "The whole town is already here, Father. The preacher, the witnesses, everyone dressed in their finest clothes. If we're going to do this, let's do it properly." Barrett's smile was cold and calculating. "Oh, we'll do it properly, all right. And when it's over, everyone will know exactly what happens when people forget their place in the natural order of things." But as the crowd began to move toward the Ashford ranch, excitement building with every step, Barrett failed to notice the way Evelyn's eyes lingered on Cole Mercer's weathered hands as he adjusted his father's silver spurs. He failed to see the quiet determination in the cowboy's stride, or the way the other ranch hands fell into step behind him with expressions of grim respect. Most importantly, Barrett Thornfield failed to understand that some challenges, once issued, change everything regardless of who wins or loses. The wedding that was supposed to cement his power and position had become something else entirely, a test of character that would reveal truths no one was prepared to face. Thunder was waiting in the far pasture, a magnificent black stallion whose reputation had spread far beyond Iron Creek. As the crowd made its way toward what everyone sensed would be either a triumph or a tragedy, none of them could have imagined how this simple challenge would unravel secrets, expose lies, and ultimately determine not just who would marry Evelyn Ashford, but what kind of town Iron Creek would become. The procession from the church to the Ashford ranch had the strange quality of a funeral and a festival combined. Children ran alongside the adults, their Sunday shoes kicking up dust clouds, while their mothers called after them to mind their clothes. The men walked in clusters, discussing the odds and sharing stories of other horses they'd seen broken or refused to be broken. Through it all, Evelyn maintained her composure, though her hand kept moving unconsciously to the small locket at her throat. The locket had belonged to her mother, Catherine Ashford, who had died when Evelyn was 15. Inside was a tiny photograph of her parents on their wedding day, but more importantly, it contained a pressed violet that her mother had picked on the day she'd decided to marry Harold, despite her own father's objections. Catherine had been a spirited woman who'd married for love rather than convenience, and she'd often told Evelyn that the most important decisions in life were the ones that required the most courage. As they walked, Evelyn found herself falling into step beside Cole, though she was careful to maintain a proper distance. The crowd's attention was focused on the spectacle ahead, giving them a brief moment of relative privacy. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I didn't issue this challenge lightly." Cole glanced at her, noting the way the morning sun caught the copper highlights in her dark hair. "Miss Ashford, I'm not sure I understand why you issued it at all." "Because I've been watching you work with the difficult horses," Evelyn replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen how you approach them with patience instead of force, with respect instead of dominance. Most men try to break a horse's spirit. You try to earn its trust. Cole felt his cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. Horses aren't much different from people, I suppose. They respond better to kindness than to fear. Exactly, Evelyn said, and there was something fierce in her voice, which is why I couldn't stand by and watch Barrett humiliate you for the entertainment of the crowd. A man's worth isn't measured by the weight of his purse or the fineness of his clothes. They walked in silence for a moment, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the excited chatter of the crowd around them. Finally, Cole spoke again. Miss Ashford, I have to ask, are you prepared for what happens if I fail? Because thunder has hurt men before. Good men, skilled riders. And if I can't stay on his back, Barrett Thornfield isn't going to let either of us forget it. Evelyn's hand went to her locket again, and she seemed to draw strength from the small piece of her mother's memory. Mr. Mercer, are you prepared for what happens if you succeed? The question caught Cole off guard. He'd been so focused on the immediate challenge that he hadn't really considered the implications of victory. If he managed to ride thunder, Evelyn would call off her wedding to one of the most powerful men in 3 counties. The social and economic consequences would ripple through Iron Creek like stones thrown into still water. I suppose I haven't thought that far ahead, Cole admitted. Well, you should, Evelyn said. And now there was something almost urgent in her tone. Because Barrett doesn't take kindly to being shown up, especially not by someone he considers beneath his notice. If you ride thunder, you'll have made an enemy who has the power and influence to make your life very difficult. Cole stopped walking, forcing Evelyn to stop as well. The crowd continued past them, but he kept his voice low. Miss Ashford, are you trying to talk me out of this? No, Evelyn said immediately. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're risking, because once this is over, there's no going back to the way things were. They resumed walking, but Cole's mind was racing. He thought about his father's spurs, about the dignity that had been passed down to him, along with the worn silver. He thought about the other ranch hands who looked to him for guidance, and about the way Barrett's casual cruelty had made him feel small and worthless in front of the entire town. Miss Ashford, he said finally, can I ask you something? Of course. Why me? If you wanted to call off your wedding, surely there were easier ways to do it. Why stake everything on whether a cowboy you barely know can ride a horse that's never been ridden? Evelyn was quiet for so long that Cole began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the sounds of the crowd. Because in all my life, I've never seen anyone stand up to Barrett Thornfield the way you did back there. Not with violence or threats, but with simple dignity. And because, she paused, as if weighing whether to continue, because I've been watching you for months, Mr. Mercer. The way you treat the horses, the way you help the other hands, the way you carry yourself even when you think no one is looking, you have something that can't be bought or inherited. You have honor. Cole felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Miss Ashford, there they are, someone shouted from ahead. There's thunder. The crowd surged forward, and Cole's response was lost in the excitement. They'd reached the far pasture where the black stallion grazed alone, separated from the other horses by a sturdy fence that bore the scars of previous escape attempts. Thunder raised his magnificent head at the approach of so many people, his ears pricked forward and his muscles tensing for flight. Even from a distance, it was clear why this horse had earned his fearsome reputation. He stood 17 hands high, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. His neck was thick with muscle, his legs powerful and perfectly proportioned. But it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with a wildness that spoke of wide plains and endless skies. Beautiful animal, someone in the crowd murmured, and heads nodded in agreement. Beautiful and deadly, added another voice. Remember what happened to Tom Wilson when he tried to break him last spring. Cole studied the stallion, noting the way Thunder held himself proud but wary, magnificent but clearly dangerous. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of superior horsemanship. This was going to require something more. Barrett pushed through the crowd, his earlier anger replaced by confident satisfaction. "Well, Mercer, there's your challenge. Still feeling brave?" Cole didn't answer immediately. He was watching Thunder, trying to read the horse's body language, looking for clues about what approach might work where others had failed. The stallion was clearly intelligent. His eyes tracked the movements of the crowd, and his ears swiveled constantly, processing every sound. "I'll need a few minutes to observe him," Cole said finally, "and I'll need everyone to step back and be quiet. He's already nervous with all these people around." "You'll get your few minutes," Barrett said dismissively. "But don't expect them to change anything. That horse has been the ruin of better men than you." As the crowd reluctantly moved back to give Cole space, Evelyn remained near the fence, her wedding dress bright against the weathered wood. She watched as Cole approached the pasture gate with slow, deliberate movements, his attention entirely focused on the magnificent, dangerous animal that would determine both their fates. Thunder snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground, watching this new human with the same intense scrutiny that Cole was giving him. It was a moment of mutual assessment that felt charged with possibility and peril in equal measure. Cole's father's spurs jingled softly as he settled into position by the fence. Whatever happened next, he knew that his life and Evelyn's would never be the same. Barrett Thornfield checked his gold pocket watch with the practiced gesture of a man who used time as a weapon. The heavy timepiece had belonged to his grandfather, a railroad baron who'd built his fortune by never giving his enemies a moment longer than absolutely necessary to prepare their defenses. Barrett had learned that lesson well, and as he snapped the watch shut, he was already calculating how to turn Cole Mercer's inevitable failure into a tool for crushing any future rebellion from Evelyn. The crowd had grown during their walk from the church, as word of the challenge spread through Iron Creek like wildfire. Ranch hands had abandoned their Sunday rest, shopkeepers had closed their doors, and even the saloon girls had come to see what all the commotion was about. Barrett estimated nearly 200 people now surrounded the pasture, and every one of them would witness Cole's humiliation, and by extension, Evelyn's foolishness in choosing a common cowboy over a man of substance. 5 minutes, Barrett called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's all the time you need to look at a horse, isn't it, Mercer?" Cole didn't respond to the taunt. He was studying Thunder with the intense concentration of a man whose life might depend on reading the animal's intentions correctly. The stallion had moved to the center of the pasture, maintaining equal distance from all sides of the fence, a tactical position that would give him maximum room to maneuver if he needed to flee or fight. Evelyn watched the exchange between man and horse with growing anxiety. She'd issued the challenge in a moment of fury at Barrett's cruelty, but now she was beginning to understand the full magnitude of what she'd set in motion. If Cole was seriously injured, she would carry the guilt for the rest of her life. If he succeeded in riding Thunder, she would have to face the social and economic consequences of defying one of the most powerful men in the territory. Having second thoughts, my dear, Harold Ashford had moved to stand beside his daughter, his voice carrying the weight of paternal disappointment. "It's not too late to call this off and apologize to Barrett. A wedding can be postponed, but a reputation, once damaged, is nearly impossible to repair." "I'm not the one who needs to worry about my reputation, father," Evelyn replied, her eyes never leaving Cole's figure by the fence. "I'm not the one who chose to publicly humiliate a man for the crime of having less money." Harold's jaw tightened. "Barrett is going to be your husband, Evelyn. In a few hours, his reputation will be yours, and yours will be his. Whatever personal feelings you may have developed about this situation, you need to consider the practical implications of your actions." The words "personal feelings" hung in the air between them, and Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. Had her father noticed the way she looked at Cole during her morning rides? Had he seen something in her behavior that revealed more than she'd intended to show? "What exactly are you suggesting, father?" I'm suggesting that a wise woman doesn't stake her future on a romantic notion about a cowboy she barely knows, Harold said bluntly. Cole Mercer is a decent enough man, I'll grant you that, but decent and suitable are two very different things. You've been raised for a particular kind of life, Evelyn. Barrett can provide that life. Cole Mercer cannot. Before Evelyn could respond, a commotion near the pasture fence drew their attention. Cole had entered the enclosure, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward Thunder. The stallion's reaction was immediate. He threw his head high, snorted loudly, and began moving in a wide circle around the perimeter of the pasture. "Easy, boy," Cole's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Barrett laughed harshly. "Listen to him talking to that animal like it's a person. This is going to be over faster than I thought." But something in Cole's approach was different from what the crowd had expected. Instead of trying to corner Thunder or advancing aggressively with rope or bridle, Cole simply stood in the center of the pasture and waited. The stallion continued his circling pattern, but his movements began to slow as curiosity apparently overcame his initial alarm. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "Looks like he's just standing there," came the reply. "Maybe he's scared," another voice suggested, and Barrett's smile widened. But Evelyn could see something the others missed. Cole's posture wasn't that of a frightened man. It was the stance of someone who understood that patience could be more powerful than force. She'd seen him use the same approach with the difficult horses around the ranch, and she found herself holding her breath as Thunder's circles grew smaller and more controlled. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless, with people shifting from foot to foot and murmuring among themselves about when the real action would begin. Barrett consulted his pocket watch again, his satisfaction evident as he calculated how this display of inactivity would reflect on both Cole and Evelyn. "This is embarrassing," Barrett announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I expected at least some attempt at actual horsemanship, not this whatever this is supposed to be." Cole still didn't respond to the provocation. Thunder had stopped circling now and was standing perhaps 20 feet away, his magnificent head raised and his ears pricked forward. The two were studying each other with mutual respect, and something that might have been understanding was passing between them. "He's establishing trust," Evelyn said quietly, more to herself than to her father. "He's wasting time," Harold replied. "Barrett's right, this is becoming a spectacle for all the wrong reasons." But as if to contradict Harold's assessment, Thunder took a step toward Cole. Then another. The crowd held its collective breath as the stallion approached the motionless cowboy, his movement cautious but clearly voluntary. "Would you look at that?" old Pete McKinnon muttered, his weathered face creased with surprise. "That horse is actually walking up to him." Cole extended one hand slowly, palm up, in a gesture that was somehow both offering and invitation. Thunder stretched his powerful neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Cole's scent. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and horse remained perfectly still, connected by nothing more than mutual respect and trust. Then Thunder allowed Cole to touch his muzzle. The crowd's reaction was immediate gasps, excited whispers, and more than a few expressions of amazement. Barrett's confident smile faltered for the first time since the challenge had been issued. "Well, I'll be damned," someone said, and heads nodded in agreement throughout the crowd. Cole began moving his hands slowly along Thunder's neck, speaking in low, soothing tones that the crowd couldn't quite hear. The stallion stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. "He's actually doing it," Evelyn breathed, her hand unconsciously moving to her mother's locket. "Touching a horse isn't the same as riding it," Barrett said quickly, but there was something forced about his confidence now. "Wait until he actually tries to get on that animal's back. That's when we'll see what he's really made of." As if he'd heard Barrett's words, Cole began moving toward Thunder's left side, his movement still slow and deliberate. The stallion's ears swiveled to track Cole's position, but he didn't move away. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, as if he understood what was coming next and had decided to allow it. Cole placed both hands on Thunder's back, applying gentle pressure to test the horse's reaction. Thunder tensed slightly, but didn't bolt or rear. Encouraged, Cole began the delicate process of mounting a horse that had never allowed a rider. The crowd watched in absolute silence as Cole slowly swung his leg over Thunder's back. For a moment, both man and horse remained perfectly still, as if neither quite believed what was happening. Then Thunder took a step forward, carrying his first rider with surprising gentleness. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but the celebration was premature. Cole had succeeded in mounting Thunder, but the real test was still to come. Everyone present knew that the stallion's gentleness could change to fury in an instant, and that staying on his back for a full minute would require more than trust. It would require a miracle. In the tack room of the Ashford barn hung an old saddle that told a story most people in Iron Creek preferred to forget. The leather was cracked and stained dark in places where blood had soaked in and never quite washed out. It had belonged to Marcus Webb, a talented horseman who'd come through town 2 years ago with big talk about breaking Thunder and making his fortune. The saddle was all that remained of Marcus's ambitions and a grave marker in the town cemetery that bore only his name and the date he died. Cole had discovered Thunder's history piece by piece during his time at the Ashford ranch. The stallion hadn't always been wild. He'd been born on a ranch in Colorado, raised by a family who'd treated him with kindness until drought and debt forced them to sell their livestock. Thunder had passed through several hands after that, each owner trying different methods to break his spirit, each failure making him more distrustful of humans. The pattern was always the same. Men would approach Thunder with ropes and force, determined to prove their dominance. The horse would submit temporarily, seeming to accept saddle and bridle, then explode into violence when they tried to mount him. 3 men had been hospitalized. Marcus Webb had been killed when Thunder threw him against a fence post with enough force to snap his neck. But as Cole sat astride the magnificent stallion now, feeling the animal's muscles tense beneath him, he understood something that the others had missed. Thunder wasn't evil or cursed, he was traumatized. Every act of rebellion was actually a desperate attempt to protect himself from more pain. "Easy, boy," Cole murmured, his voice barely audible to the crowd watching from beyond the fence. "I know they hurt you before. I know you learned not to trust. But I'm not them." Thunder's ears flicked back at the sound of Cole's voice, and for a moment the stallion stood perfectly still. Cole could feel the animal's indecision, the war between instinct and curiosity that was raging beneath Thunder's proud exterior. Then, without warning, Thunder exploded into motion. The stallion's first buck was so powerful it nearly threw Cole immediately, but the cowboy had been expecting it. He'd seen the slight shift in Thunder's weight, the almost imperceptible gathering of muscles that preceded the eruption. Cole gripped with his knees and rode the motion, letting his body flow with the horse's movements instead of fighting against them. Thunder spun left, then right, his hooves leaving deep gouges in the earth as he tried to dislodge his unwanted burden. The crowd gasped and shouted, some cheering for Cole and others calling warnings about the fence posts and rocks that marked the edges of the pasture. 30 seconds! Someone shouted, though Cole doubted anyone was actually timing the ride accurately. Thunder reared high, his front hooves pawing the air as he tried a different tactic. Cole leaned forward, speaking continuously in low, soothing tones that somehow carried over the thunder of hooves and the shouts of the crowd. "I know you're scared," Cole said, his words meant for Thunder alone. "I know you think this ends with pain. But look around. Boy, look at where we are." For just a moment, Thunder's movements slowed, as if he were actually listening. The stallion's head turned slightly, his intelligent eyes taking in the familiar pasture, the fence he'd tested so many times, the mountains that rose beyond the ranch boundaries. Cole seized the moment of calm to shift his weight, not trying to control Thunder but simply finding his balance again. "This is your home," he continued. "These are your fields, your water, your sky. I'm not trying to take you away from them." Thunder snorted and shook his magnificent head, but when he resumed bucking, there was something different about it. The movements were still powerful, still dangerous, but they lacked the desperate fury of before. It was as if Thunder was testing Cole rather than trying to destroy him. Barrett Thornfield watched the display with growing unease. He'd expected Cole to be thrown within seconds, probably injured badly enough to serve as an object lesson about the consequences of overreaching one's social position. Instead, the cowboy was not only staying on Thunder's back, but seemed to be communicating with the animal in ways that Barrett couldn't understand. "How long has it been?" Barrett demanded of the men standing near him. "Close to a minute, I'd say," old Pete McKinnon replied, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "Never seen anything like it." Barrett's hand moved to his pocket watch, but he didn't pull it out. Time had become his enemy now, each passing second making Cole's victory more likely and Barrett's humiliation more complete. In the pasture, Thunder had transitioned from bucking to running, carrying Cole in long, powerful strides around the perimeter of the fence. The stallion's gait was smooth now, almost playful, as if he'd suddenly discovered the joy of having a rider who didn't pull on his mouth or dig spurs into his sides. Cole found himself smiling despite the danger. Thunder was magnificent in motion, all power and grace combined in perfect harmony. For a moment, Cole forgot about the crowd, forgot about Barrett's threats and social consequences, forgot about everything except the incredible feeling of partnership with this proud, intelligent animal. "Time!" Several voices called out simultaneously. Thunder slowed to a walk, then stopped completely in the center of the pasture. Cole remained mounted, one hand resting gently on the stallion's neck, both man and horse breathing hard from their exertion. The silence that followed was profound. 200 people stood transfixed, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. It hadn't been the brutal contest of wills they'd expected, but something much more complex, a negotiation between equals that had somehow resulted in mutual respect. Cole dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady from the adrenaline and effort. Thunder stood quietly beside him, no longer the wild, untouchable creature of legend, but simply a horse who'd found a human he could trust. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Cole's attention was focused entirely on Evelyn. She stood by the fence in her white wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mother's locket. Barrett Thornfield's face had gone ashen. He pulled out his pocket watch and stared at it, as if the timepiece might somehow rewrite the last few minutes. When he looked up, his eyes held a coldness that made several people step away from him instinctively. "Well," Barrett said, his voice carrying clearly over the celebration, "I suppose that settles that." But even as he spoke the words of concession, Barrett's mind was already working on how to undo what had just happened. Cole Mercer had won the challenge, but Barrett Thornfield had not built his fortune by accepting defeat gracefully. If he couldn't win by the rules Evelyn had set, then he would simply have to change the rules. The gold pocket watch ticked steadily in his hand, counting down the time he had left to salvage his plans. Barrett's grandfather had taught him that every problem had a solution if you were willing to pay the right price and ask the right questions. And Barrett was already formulating both. The pressed wildflower had been picked 3 weeks ago, during a secret meeting that neither Cole nor Evelyn had planned. She'd been riding the boundary of her father's land when a summer storm caught her far from shelter, and Cole had found her taking refuge under a stand of cottonwoods, her horse nervous from the thunder, but her own spirit seemingly as wild as the weather itself. What had begun as a chance encounter, Cole offering to escort her safely home, had turned into an hour-long conversation that revealed more about both their characters than months of formal social interaction ever could. They'd talked about books and dreams, about the weight of family expectations and the courage required to choose your own path. When the storm cleared and they'd prepared to part ways, Evelyn had impulsively picked a small purple wildflower and pressed it between the pages of the book she'd been carrying. Now, as the crowd celebrated Cole's victory over Thunder, Evelyn felt the flower's presence in her bodice like a talisman of hope. The challenge had been won, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Barrett wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and her father's face told her that the consequences of her rebellion were far from over. "Evelyn." Harold Ashford's voice was tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk. Privately." "Not yet, father," Evelyn replied, her eyes still fixed on Cole as he led Thunder toward the gate. "I have something I need to do first." She walked toward the pasture fence, her white silk wedding dress gathering dust and burrs, but her step sure and determined. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached, sensing that this moment belonged to the young woman who'd had the courage to issue an impossible challenge, and the man who'd had the skill to meet it. Cole looked up as she approached, his face flushed from exertion and achievement. There was something different about him now. The quiet dignity had always been there, but it was overlaid now with the confidence that came from proving himself in front of the entire town. "Miss Ashford," he said, touching his hat brim in the gesture of respect that had become second nature to him. "Mr. Mercer," Evelyn replied, and her voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "It appears I owe you my congratulations, and perhaps something more." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama in the formal words that somehow carried more weight than the victory they'd just witnessed. Barrett Thornfield pushed through the circle of people, his face dark with barely controlled fury. "Evelyn, before you say anything you'll regret, I think you should consider the implications of what you're about to do." Barrett's voice carried a warning that made several people step back nervously. "I've been considering the implications for weeks," Evelyn replied, without turning to look at him. "The question is whether you've considered the implications of your own behavior." "My behavior?" Barrett's laugh was harsh and bitter. "My behavior has been that of a gentleman who was publicly humiliated by his own fiancé. I think I've shown remarkable restraint under the circumstances." Cole stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Evelyn and Barrett. "Mr. Thornfield," Miss Ashford fulfilled her part of the bargain. "I rode Thunder for the required time. I think that means—" "It means nothing," Barrett interrupted, his voice rising dangerously. "A foolish wager made by a silly girl doesn't supersede a legal engagement or a business arrangement between her father and myself." "Business arrangement?" Evelyn turned to face Barrett now, her green eyes blazing. "Is that what you call our engagement? A business arrangement? What else would you call it?" Barrett shot back. "Your father needed capital for his railroad investments. I needed the social standing that comes with marrying into an established family. You were part of the negotiation, nothing more." The casual cruelty of Barrett's words struck the crowd like a physical blow. Even those who'd sided with him began to shift uncomfortably, recognizing that he'd revealed more about his character than he'd intended. Harold Ashford pushed through the crowd, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Barrett, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No, father," Evelyn said firmly. "I think it's time everything was discussed publicly. Barrett has made his feelings perfectly clear. I was never anything more than a commodity in his eyes, something to be bought and sold for his convenience." She turned back to Cole, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "Mr. Mercer, you've proven yourself a man of courage and honor. You accepted an impossible challenge and succeeded through patience and skill rather than force. You've shown more character in one morning than some men show in a lifetime." Cole felt his heart racing as he realized what was coming. "Miss Ashford, I hereby release myself from my engagement to Barrett Thornfield," Evelyn announced, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "And I formally invite you to call on me as a suitor if you're willing to face the challenges that such a courtship would entail." The crowd's reaction was explosive. Some cheered, others gasped, and more than a few began talking excitedly about the social upheaval they'd just witnessed. Through it all, Barrett stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been panic. "You can't do this," Barrett said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "You're under contract. Legal documents have been signed. Your father has already received my investment in his railroad venture." "Then you'll have to work that out with my father," Evelyn replied calmly. "But as for me, I'm free to choose my own future." Barrett's hand moved toward his gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by several of the men in the crowd. Old Pete McKinnon stepped closer, his own weapon visible beneath his coat. "Barrett," Harold Ashford said quickly, recognizing the danger in the younger man's posture. "Let's not do anything rash. These matters can be resolved through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Barrett's voice was rising again. "Your daughter just humiliated me in front of the entire town. She chose a penniless cowboy over a man who could give her everything." "Maybe that tells you something about what she values," Cole said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the tense silence. Barrett whirled on him, his face contorted with rage. "And what exactly do you have to offer her? A shack on the wrong side of town? A life of poverty and hardship? You think love conquers all, Mercer? You think fairy tales come true just because you can ride a horse?" Cole met Barrett's gaze steadily. "I think Miss Ashford is smart enough to know the difference between a man who respects her and a man who sees her as property, and I think she's brave enough to choose accordingly." For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence, the entire crowd holding its breath. Barrett's hand was still near his gun, and Cole had no weapon except his reputation for fairness and the grudging respect he'd earned from the other ranch hands. Then Barrett stepped back, his face settling into an expression of cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his rage had been. "Enjoy your victory, Mercer," Barrett said softly. "Both of you. But remember, in this territory, a man's reputation can change very quickly. Heroes can become villains overnight, especially when people start asking the right questions about their past." With that ominous warning, Barrett turned and stalked away, pushing through the crowd with barely controlled violence. Several people scrambled to get out of his way, sensing that his humiliation was far from over and that the consequences would be felt by more than just Cole and Evelyn. As Barrett disappeared toward town, Evelyn felt for the pressed wildflower hidden in her dress. The small token of her first real conversation with Cole seemed to pulse with promise and possibility, but also with the weight of the dangerous game they'd just begun to play. The challenge had been won, but the war for their future was just beginning. The forged documents arrived in Iron Creek 3 days after Cole's triumph over Thunder, carried by a federal marshal who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Barrett Thornfield met the lawman at the edge of town, his manner respectful, but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he reviewed the papers that would destroy Cole Mercer once and for all. The documents were masterfully crafted, bearing official seals and signatures that would fool anyone who wasn't an expert in government paperwork. They identified Cole Mercer as wanted for armed robbery in Kansas, cattle rustling in Nebraska, and assault of a federal officer in Colorado. The descriptions matched closely enough to be believable, and the dates were carefully chosen to correspond with times when Cole had been traveling between jobs, when his whereabouts couldn't be easily verified. Barrett had paid dearly for the forgery's $5,000 to a man in Denver who specialized in creating new identities for those who could afford them. The irony wasn't lost on Barrett that he was using criminal methods to brand an honest man as a criminal, but he'd long ago learned that victory mattered more than virtue in the struggle for power and position. Marshal James Crawford was an honest man caught in an impossible situation. The documents looked authentic. The descriptions matched the cowboy he'd seen ride Thunder 3 days earlier, and federal law required him to make the arrest, regardless of his personal feelings about the matter. But something about the timing bothered him. Why had these warrants surfaced now, just days after Cole had become the town hero? "I'll need to take him in for questioning," Crawford told Barrett as they rode toward the Ashford ranch. But I have to tell you, Mr. Thornfield, something about this doesn't sit right with me. I understand your reluctance, Marshal. Barrett replied smoothly. Mercer has fooled a lot of people with his humble act, but the law is the law, regardless of how charming a criminal might be. Word of the Marshal's arrival spread through Iron Creek faster than a prairie fire. By the time Crawford and Barrett reached the ranch, a crowd had already gathered, including many of the same people who'd witnessed Cole's victory over Thunder. But the mood was different, now uncertain, fearful, with the kind of tension that comes when people realize they might have been deceived. Cole was working with Thunder in the corral when the Marshal arrived, the stallion responding to his gentle guidance with an eagerness that spoke of genuine partnership. The sight of the two together, man and horse moving in perfect harmony, made Crawford even more reluctant to believe the charges in the documents he carried. "Cole Mercer," Crawford called out, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. Cole looked up from his work with Thunder, immediately sensing trouble in the Marshal's formal tone and Barrett's satisfied expression. "Yes, sir. I'm Cole Mercer. I'm Federal Marshal Crawford. I need you to come with me for questioning regarding some serious charges that have been filed against you." The words hit the gathered crowd like a thunderbolt. Gasps and excited whispers rippled through the group as people tried to process this dramatic reversal of fortune. Cole's face went pale, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of charges, Marshal?" Crawford consulted the forged documents, reading the accusations in a tone that suggested he found them distasteful. Armed robbery in Kansas, cattle rustling in Nebraska, assault on a federal officer in Colorado. The descriptions match, and the timeline fits your movements over the past few years. "Those charges are false," Cole said immediately. "I've never committed any of those crimes. I can provide references from every ranch where I've worked." "I'm sure you can," Barrett interjected, his voice filled with false sympathy. "Criminals are often quite skilled at creating false personas and fooling honest people. It's how they operate." Evelyn pushed through the crowd, her face blazing with indignation. "This is ridiculous. Cole is one of the most honest men I've ever known. These charges are obviously..." "Obviously what, Miss Ashford?" Barrett challenged her. "Obviously false because you don't want to believe them, or obviously timed to discredit a man who just embarrassed me in front of the entire town." Marshal Crawford held up his hand for silence. "Regardless of anyone's personal feelings, I have a legal obligation to investigate these charges. Mr. Mercer, I'm placing you under arrest pending a full inquiry." "Marshal," old Pete McKinnon stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "I've known Cole for 3 years. He's worked my land, helped my neighbors, never caused a moment's trouble. These charges don't fit the man I know." "I appreciate your testimony, Mr. McKinnon," Crawford replied respectfully, "and it will be considered during the investigation. But until then, the law requires me to act on these warrants." Cole handed Thunder's lead rope to one of the other ranch hands, his movements careful and controlled despite the chaos erupting around him. "Marshal, I'll come with you willingly, but I want everyone here to know that these charges are false. I've never stolen anything in my life, and I've never raised a hand against a lawman." "Of course you'd say that," Barrett said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "What criminal wouldn't protest his innocence? The question is whether the good people of Iron Creek are going to be fooled by a man who's been lying to them for years." Evelyn felt her world tilting as she watched the Marshal place shackles on Cole's wrists. The man who'd shown such courage and dignity just 3 days earlier was now being led away like a common criminal, and the crowd that had cheered his victory was now murmuring among themselves about signs they should have seen, warnings they should have heeded. "This isn't over," Evelyn called out as Cole was led toward the Marshal's horse. "I'll prove these charges are false, no matter what it takes." Cole turned to look at her one last time before being helped onto the Marshal's spare mount. "Miss Ashford, you need to be careful. Men who would forge federal documents won't hesitate to hurt anyone who threatens to expose them." The words carried clearly to Barrett, who smiled coldly. "Forged documents? Is that your defense, Mercer, that federal marshals are part of some conspiracy against you? Marshal Crawford frowned as he mounted his own horse. Nobody said anything about forged documents, Mr. Mercer. That's an interesting accusation to make. It's the accusation of a desperate man, Barrett replied quickly. He knows he's been caught, so he's trying to create doubt about the evidence. As the marshal and his prisoner rode toward town, Evelyn stood frozen by the corral fence, her mind racing. Cole's parting words had been a warning, but they'd also been a clue. The timing of these charges was too convenient, the accusations too perfectly designed to destroy Cole's reputation just when Barrett needed it most. Barrett approached her, his manner solicitous, but his eyes cold with triumph. "I'm sorry you had to see this, Evelyn. I know you'd developed feelings for him, but perhaps now you understand why I was so concerned about your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Evelyn replied, her voice quiet but steady. "The question is what lengths you were willing to go to ensure that Cole couldn't threaten your plans." Barrett's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I had nothing to do with these charges coming to light. Justice has its own timeline." "Justice," Evelyn repeated, her hand moving unconsciously to her mother's locket. "Yes, I suppose it does. And I suspect we'll all learn more about justice in the coming days than any of us expected." As Barrett walked away, confident in his victory, he failed to notice the way Evelyn's fingers traced the outline of the pressed wildflower hidden in her dress. He failed to see the determination growing in her eyes, or the way several of the ranch hands had gathered around old Pete McKinnon for a whispered conference. Most importantly, Barrett Thornfield failed to understand that some victories come at too high a price, and that the very ruthlessness that had secured his temporary triumph might ultimately ensure his downfall. Cole's father's Bible was worn smooth from years of handling, its leather cover cracked along the edges where thumbs had gripped it during moments of desperate need. The pages were thin and yellowed, marked with underlined passages and margin notes, written in the careful script of a man who'd found solace in Scripture during the darkest periods of his life. Cole held the book now in his jail cell, drawing strength from the familiar weight of it as he faced what might be his final hours of freedom. Marshal Crawford had allowed Cole to keep the Bible after searching it thoroughly for hidden weapons or tools that might aid an escape attempt. The lawman's examination had been respectful but thorough, and Cole could see in his eyes a growing uncertainty about the charges he'd been forced to bring. The forged documents were convincing, but they couldn't quite overcome Crawford's instincts about character and truth. "Your father's?" Crawford had asked when he'd handed the Bible back. "Yes, sir. He carried it through the war, then through 20 years of ranch work. Always said it was the only thing that never let him down." Crawford had nodded thoughtfully. "Mine carried one just like it. Said the same thing." Now, as evening shadows lengthened across the jail cell, Cole opened the Bible to Psalm 23 and read the familiar words that had comforted his father through trials that made Cole's current situation seem manageable by comparison. The passage about walking through the valley of the shadow of death seemed particularly relevant as he contemplated the legal proceedings that would determine whether he lived as a free man or died as a convicted criminal. Outside the jail, Iron Creek was buzzing with activity unlike anything the town had seen since the railroad's arrival. The arrest of the man who'd tamed Thunder had divided the community into factions, those who believed the charges and felt foolish for being deceived, and those who remained convinced that Cole was the victim of an elaborate frame-up. Evelyn Ashford belonged firmly to the second group, and she'd spent the past 2 days conducting her own investigation with a determination that both impressed and worried her father. She'd ridden to 3 neighboring towns, seeking anyone who might have known Cole during his travels, looking for witnesses who could verify his whereabouts during the times when the alleged crimes had been committed. "Evelyn, you need to stop this," Harold Ashford said as his daughter prepared for another day of investigation. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and you're accomplishing nothing except to provide more gossip for people who already think you've lost your mind." "Have I lost my mind, Father?" Evelyn asked as she checked her saddlebags for the notes she'd been compiling. "Or have I simply realized that love requires action, not just pretty words?" Harold studied his daughter's face, seeing something there that reminded him powerfully of her mother during the early days of their courtship. Catherine Ashford had possessed the same fierce loyalty, the same willingness to fight for what she believed in, regardless of social consequences. "Your mother would be proud of you," Harold said quietly, "and terrified for you. Barrett Thornfield is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully, and you've made yourself his enemy." "Barrett made himself my enemy when he chose to destroy an innocent man rather than accept the results of a fair challenge," Evelyn replied. "I'm simply choosing to fight back." While Evelyn continued her investigation, Barrett was dealing with problems of his own. Marshal Crawford had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the timing of the federal warrants and, more importantly, about the sources who had provided the information leading to the charges. The marshal was experienced enough to recognize when something didn't smell right, and his instincts were telling him that Cole Mercer was being railroaded. "I need to send some telegrams," Crawford told Barrett. "Verify these charges with the original jurisdictions. Make sure everything is legitimate." "Of course," Barrett replied smoothly, though inwardly he was calculating how long it would take for responses to arrive and whether the man who'd created the forgeries had been thorough enough to cover all possible inquiries. "I also need to interview some of the people who've known Mercer since he arrived in Iron Creek," Crawford continued. "Get a better sense of his character and behavior patterns." "Certainly," Barrett agreed, though he was already planning how to influence those interviews through carefully placed suggestions about the kinds of deceptions skilled criminals were capable of maintaining. But Barrett's greatest concern wasn't the marshal's investigation. It was the possibility that Evelyn's amateur detective work might uncover something that professional law enforcement would miss. Barrett knew his forged documents would hold up under normal scrutiny, but Evelyn was approaching the problem from angles that a federal marshal might not consider. The danger became real on the third day after Cole's arrest, when Evelyn returned from a trip to Junction City with information that made Barrett's blood run cold. She'd found a retired cavalry officer named Captain Morrison, who remembered Cole from a cattle drive 2 years earlier, a drive that had taken place during the exact time period when Cole was supposedly robbing banks in Kansas. Captain Morrison kept detailed records of all his transactions. Evelyn explained to a growing crowd outside the jail. "He has receipts, signed contracts, even a photograph of his crew that includes Cole. The dates are indisputable." Marshal Crawford emerged from the jail to listen to Evelyn's report, his expression growing more troubled with each detail she provided. If her information was accurate, then at least one of the charges against Cole was demonstrably false, which raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the others. "Miss Ashford," Crawford said carefully, "are you certain of these dates? Memories can be unreliable, and people sometimes confuse one year with another." "I'm certain," Evelyn replied firmly. "Captain Morrison showed me his ledger books, his correspondence with the buyers, everything. Cole was working for him from March through September of that year, hundreds of miles from where he supposedly committed those robberies." Barrett stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Marshal, surely you're not going to take the word of some old soldier who probably can't remember what he had for breakfast, let alone the details of a cattle drive from 2 years ago." "Captain Morrison's memory seemed quite sharp to me," Evelyn shot back. "Sharp enough to remember that Cole saved his entire herd when rustlers attacked the drive. Sharp enough to remember recommending Cole to 3 other ranchers after the drive was completed." The crowd was murmuring among themselves now, sensing that the tide was beginning to turn in Cole's favor. Barrett could feel his carefully constructed plan starting to unravel, and he knew he had to act quickly to prevent complete exposure. "Even if Miss Ashford is correct about one incident," Barrett said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "that doesn't prove anything about the other charges. Criminals often have legitimate employment between their illegal activities." It's how they avoid suspicion. But Marshal Crawford was no longer listening to Barrett's explanations. He was studying Evelyn's documentation with the keen eye of a man who'd spent years distinguishing between truth and deception. The evidence she'd gathered was compelling, detailed, and most importantly, verifiable through independent sources. "Mr. Thornfield," Crawford said finally, "I think we need to have a private conversation about how these charges came to your attention." Barrett's confident facade began to crack. "I'm not sure what you mean, Marshal. I simply reported what I'd heard from reliable sources about Mercer's background." "What sources?" Crawford pressed. "Because I'm going to need to verify their information, and right now it's looking like at least some of these charges are fabricated." The word fabricated hit Barrett like a physical blow. If the Marshal started investigating the sources of the charges, it wouldn't take long to discover the truth about the forged documents. Barrett's mind raced as he calculated his options, and none of them looked promising. In his jail cell, Cole looked up from his father's Bible as he heard the raised voices outside. He couldn't make out all the words, but he could hear Evelyn's voice among the others, strong and clear, and filled with righteous indignation. The sound gave him hope, but it also filled him with fear for her safety. Barrett Thornfield was a dangerous man backed into a corner, and Cole knew from experience that such men were capable of anything. As he resumed his reading, Cole found himself praying not for his own freedom, but for Evelyn's protection in the battle she was fighting on his behalf. The Bible's familiar words offered comfort, but they also carried a warning that seemed particularly relevant to their current situation. "Be sure your sin will find you out." Barrett's sins were beginning to catch up with him, and the reckoning that followed would determine the fate of everyone involved in this desperate game of truth and deception. Thunder's broken halter lay in the dust of the corral like a symbol of transformation, its leather straps torn from the stallion's desperate attempt to reach Cole during the confrontation that would determine both their fates. The magnificent horse had been restless since his partner's arrest, pacing the boundaries of his pasture and calling out with a mournful sound that seemed to echo the grief of everyone who believed in Cole's innocence. Marshal Crawford had reluctantly agreed to bring Cole from the jail to face Barrett's final accusation in the place where this entire drama had begun. The evidence Evelyn had gathered was compelling, but Barrett had one last card to play: a witness who claimed to have seen Cole commit one of the robberies in question. The confrontation would take place in front of the entire town, a public trial that would determine whether justice or corruption would prevail in Iron Creek. The crowd was larger than the one that had gathered for Evelyn's original challenge, drawn by word that the truth about Cole Mercer would finally be revealed. But the mood was different, now tense and divided, with neighbors eyeing each other suspiciously as they chose sides in a conflict that had exposed the fault lines running through their community. Cole walked toward the corral with his hands shackled, flanked by Marshal Crawford and two deputies who'd arrived from the county seat. His face was calm, but those who knew him could see the toll that 3 days in jail had taken. The quiet dignity was still there, but it was overlaid now with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle where the rules keep changing. Barrett stood near the corral fence, his expensive clothes and confident posture marking him as a man still certain of victory. Beside him stood a stranger, a thin, nervous-looking man who kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. This was supposedly the witness who would seal Cole's fate, though something about his manner suggested he was less than comfortable with his role in the proceedings. "Marshal Crawford," Barrett called out as the lawman approached, "I'd like you to meet Samuel Briggs." Mr. Briggs was passing through Dodge City when the robbery occurred, and he got a clear look at the perpetrator. Crawford studied the nervous man with the practiced eye of someone who'd interviewed thousands of witnesses over the years. "Mr. Briggs, you're certain you can identify the man you saw?" "Yes, sir," Briggs replied, his voice slightly higher than normal. "Clear as day. I was standing right outside the bank when he came running out with the money bag." And you're prepared to swear that this man, Crawford gestured toward Cole, is the same person you saw that day? Briggs looked at Cole, and for a moment, his resolve seemed to waver. But then Barrett moved slightly closer to him, and Briggs straightened his shoulders. That's him, all right. I'd recognize that face anywhere. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even those who'd believed in Cole's innocence began to look uncertain. Eyewitness testimony was powerful evidence, and Briggs seemed sincere in his identification. But Evelyn was studying the witness with the same intense scrutiny she'd applied to every aspect of this case. Something about Briggs bothered her, the way he avoided looking directly at Cole for more than a few seconds, the way his hands trembled despite his confident words, the way he kept glancing at Barrett as if seeking approval or reassurance. "Mr. Briggs!" Evelyn called out, stepping forward despite her father's restraining hand on her arm. "Can you describe the clothes the robber was wearing?" Barrett frowned. "Miss Ashford, this isn't a formal trial. Mr. Briggs doesn't need to submit to questioning from—" "I don't mind," Briggs interrupted quickly, perhaps too quickly. He was wearing dark pants, a light-colored shirt, and a brown hat, typical cowboy clothes. "What about his horse?" Evelyn pressed. "Surely you noticed what kind of horse a bank robber would ride." Briggs hesitated for just a moment too long. "A bay mare, I think, maybe 15 hands high." Cole looked up sharply at this description, and those who knew him well could see recognition in his eyes. "Marshal," Cole said quietly, "I've never owned a bay mare in my life. My horse is a chestnut gelding, 16 hands high, with a white star on his forehead. Anyone who's seen me ride can verify that." Old Pete McKinnon stepped forward from the crowd. "That's right, Marshal. Cole's been riding the same horse for 3 years. Chestnut gelding named Copper. Never seen him on any other mount." "Horses can be stolen or traded," Barrett said quickly. "A criminal would naturally use different mounts to avoid identification." But Marshal Crawford was watching Briggs's face carefully, and he didn't like what he saw there. The man was sweating despite the cool morning air, and his eyes kept darting between Barrett and the crowd as if he were looking for an escape route. "Mr. Briggs," Crawford said slowly, "bank robberies are serious business. Are you absolutely certain about your identification? Because if you're wrong, an innocent man could hang for crimes he didn't commit." The weight of Crawford's words seemed to hit Briggs like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he swayed slightly on his feet. I'm certain it was him." But his voice lacked conviction now, and several people in the crowd were beginning to whisper among themselves. The tide of opinion was shifting again, and Barrett could feel his final gambit beginning to fail. Thunder chose that moment to make his presence known. The stallion had been watching the proceedings from his pasture, and something about the tension in the air seemed to trigger his protective instincts. He approached the fence that separated him from Cole, stretching his magnificent neck over the top rail and nickering softly. Cole turned toward the sound, his shackled hands reaching instinctively toward his four-legged partner. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "It's all right." The sight of the bond between man and horse was visible to everyone present. Thunder's eyes were fixed on Cole with an intensity that spoke of genuine partnership, while Cole's entire demeanor softened in the presence of the animal he'd learned to trust. "Now that," old Pete McKinnon said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is not the behavior of a horse with a criminal. Animals know character better than most people do." Barrett's face was flushed with frustration and growing panic. Nothing was going according to his plan, and he could see his carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble under the weight of truth and genuine human connection. "This is ridiculous," Barrett snapped. "We're supposed to be listening to witness testimony, not getting sentimental about a horse." But even as he spoke, Barrett could see that he was losing the crowd. The people of Iron Creek were beginning to remember why they'd cheered for Cole in the first place, not just because he'd ridden Thunder, but because he'd done it with patience and respect, rather than force and cruelty. Marshal Crawford made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Briggs, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain that Cole Mercer is the man you saw rob that bank in Dodge City? Barrett's loaded pistol was a Colt Peacemaker that had never been fired in anger, its silver-plated barrel engraved with his initials and a design of crossed rifles that spoke more of vanity than actual combat experience. He'd worn the weapon as a symbol of his power and status, never imagining that he might actually need to use it to preserve his carefully constructed lies. But as Samuel Briggs stood frozen under Marshall Crawford's penetrating stare, Barrett realized that his final gambit was about to collapse. Briggs began, his voice cracking with the weight of the decision he faced. The money Barrett had paid him was substantial, enough to set him up for life in California, where no one would ask questions about his past. But the knowledge that an innocent man might hang because of his false testimony was eating away at whatever conscience he had left. "Take your time, Mr. Briggs," Marshall Crawford said quietly. "This is an important decision." Barrett could see the resolve crumbling in his purchased witness's eyes, and desperation drove him to action. His hand moved to his pistol with surprising speed for a man who'd never drawn a weapon in genuine combat. The silver-plated Colt cleared its holster with a whisper of metal against leather, and suddenly the entire confrontation had taken a deadly turn. "Nobody move," Barrett commanded, his voice tight with panic and rage. "This has gone far enough." The crowd scattered backwards with gasps of alarm, but Marshall Crawford stepped protectively in front of Cole, his own weapon appearing in his hand with the fluid motion of a man who'd survived countless dangerous situations. "Put the gun down, Thornfield," Crawford ordered. "You're only making this worse for yourself." "Worse?" Barrett laughed harshly. "How could it possibly be worse? My reputation is ruined, my business deals are falling apart, and the woman I was supposed to marry is standing there looking at me like I'm some kind of monster." "Because you are a monster," Evelyn said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You forged federal documents, bribed a false witness, and now you're threatening innocent people with a gun. What else would you call it?" Barrett swung the pistol toward Evelyn, causing her father to step protectively in front of her. "Shut up. You started all of this with your ridiculous challenge. If you'd just married me like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened." "If I'd married you," Evelyn replied, with remarkable calm, considering the weapon pointed in her direction, "I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what kind of man I'd tied myself to. Now I know." Cole struggled against his shackles, desperate to put himself between Evelyn and Barrett's gun. "Thornfield, your quarrel is with me. Leave her out of this. My quarrel is with both of you." Barrett snarled. "You humiliated me in front of the entire town, made me look like a fool, destroyed everything I'd worked for. Did you really think I was going to let that stand?" Thunder had become increasingly agitated as the confrontation escalated, the stallion's keen senses picking up on the tension and danger in the air. The great horse was pacing along the fence line now, his ears pinned back and his eyes rolling with distress. The broken halter that had once symbolized his captivity now seemed to represent his inability to help the human who'd shown him kindness and respect. "The game's over, Barrett," Marshall Crawford said, his weapon trained steadily on the panicked man. "Put down the gun and we can work this out. Keep waving it around and somebody's going to get hurt." "Somebody's already been hurt," Barrett replied. "My entire life has been destroyed because I tried to put a nobody in his place. Well, if I'm going down, I'm taking him with me." Barrett began to swing his pistol back toward Cole, but Samuel Briggs chose that moment to find his courage. "Stop," the false witness shouted. "I can't let you do this. I lied. Cole Mercer never robbed any bank. Barrett paid me to say I saw him, but I've never been to Dodge City in my life." The confession hit the crowd like a thunderbolt, but Barrett was beyond caring about exposure now. His finger tightened on the trigger as he aimed at Cole, determined to eliminate the man who'd caused his downfall, even if it meant his own destruction. Thunder saw the weapon rising toward his human partner and reacted with the protective instincts of a creature who'd finally found someone worth trusting. The stallion gathered himself and leaped the corral fence in a magnificent display of power and determination, landing between Barrett and Cole just as the pistol fired. The bullet intended for Cole struck Thunder in the shoulder, sending the great horse stumbling but not down. Thunder's momentum carried him forward into Barrett, and the impact sent the man sprawling in the dust with his weapon flying from his grasp. The crowd erupted in chaos as Marshal Crawford and his deputies moved to secure Barrett, while Cole fought desperately against his shackles to reach Thunder's side. The stallion was bleeding from the shoulder wound, but still standing, his eyes fixed on Cole with an expression that seemed to ask if his human was safe. "Easy, boy," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion as Crawford hurriedly unlocked his shackles. "You did good, Thunder. You did real good." Dr. Matthews, the town veterinarian, was already pushing through the crowd with his medical bag, and old Pete McKinnon had retrieved Barrett's pistol from the dust. Barrett himself lay motionless where Thunder's charge had left him, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his face a mask of defeat and despair. "Is he dead?" someone called out. "No," Dr. Matthews replied after a quick examination. "Knocked unconscious, maybe some broken ribs, but he'll live to stand trial." Evelyn rushed to Cole's side as he knelt beside Thunder, her white dress forgotten as she helped him examine the stallion's wound. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough," Dr. Matthews said grimly as he began cleaning the bullet wound. "But he's strong, and the bullet passed clean through. He'll recover if we can prevent infection." Cole looked up at Evelyn, seeing tears in her eyes that matched his own. "He saved my life," Cole said wonderfully. "That bullet was meant for me." "He loves you," Evelyn replied simply, "just like I do." The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any formal declaration could have been. Around them, the crowd was beginning to cheer as the full implications of what had happened became clear. Barrett's corruption had been exposed, Cole's innocence had been proven, and justice had prevailed, but at a cost that would leave its mark on everyone present. Thunder nickered softly and nuzzled Cole's shoulder, and in that simple gesture, the bonds of partnership and trust that had been forged in a moment of mutual respect were confirmed forever. The simple wedding bands were forged by the town blacksmith from silver that Cole had saved for 3 years, each coin earned through honest labor and careful planning for a future he'd hardly dared imagine. Unlike the elaborate diamond ring Barrett had commissioned for Evelyn's first engagement, these bands were plain and unadorned, their value measured not in carats or cost, but in the love and commitment they represented. 3 months had passed since Thunder's heroic charge had exposed Barrett Thornfield's corruption and vindicated Cole's innocence. Barrett himself was awaiting trial in the territorial capital, facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder that would likely see him imprisoned for the rest of his life. Samuel Briggs had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony had revealed the full extent of Barrett's scheme to destroy Cole through manufactured evidence. Thunder had recovered completely from his gunshot wound, the bullet scar on his shoulder serving as a permanent reminder of the bond between horse and rider that had transcended mere partnership to become something approaching family. The stallion now worked willingly with Cole, their trust so complete that no bridle or saddle was necessary when they rode the boundaries of what would soon become their own land. Harold Ashford had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself, by not only accepting Cole as his daughter's choice, but actively helping the young couple establish themselves in the community. The railroad investments that Barrett had funded were proving profitable beyond anyone's expectations, and Harold had used a portion of his newfound wealth to purchase a substantial ranch adjoining his own property, which he presented to Cole and Evelyn as a wedding gift. "A man needs something to build on," Harold had explained when he'd offered Cole the deed. "And my daughter needs a husband who's proven he can turn challenges into opportunities." The wedding itself was everything. Evelyn's first engagement ceremony was not intimate, heartfelt, and focused on the love between two people rather than the business arrangements that had motivated her father's original plans. The entire town turned out for the celebration, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest ranch hands, all united in their admiration for a couple who'd chosen love over convenience and truth over corruption. Old Pete McKinnon served as Cole's best man, his weathered face creased with pride as he watched his young friend exchange vows with the woman who'd been brave enough to challenge social convention for the sake of her heart. Martha from the bakery had outdone herself with a three-tier cake decorated with sugar flowers that rivaled anything from the fancy shops in San Francisco. But it was the moment when Cole slipped the simple silver band onto Evelyn's finger that crystallized everything the past months had meant. The ring was a symbol of partnership between equals, a promise of shared dreams and mutual respect that no amount of money or social standing could purchase. "With this ring," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly in the church filled with friends and neighbors, "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever challenges life may bring." Evelyn's response brought tears to more than a few eyes in the congregation. "With this ring, I promise to trust you, support you, and choose courage over comfort whenever our love requires it." The reception was held at the Ashford Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwoods and lanterns strung between the branches to provide light as evening fell. The townspeople danced to music provided by a traveling fiddle player, and stories were shared about the events that had brought the community together in ways none of them had expected. Thunder was the unofficial guest of honor, grazing peacefully in the nearby pasture, but never far from Cole's sight. The stallion's presence served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the patience to earn trust and the courage to protect what matters most. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to make their way home, Cole and Evelyn found themselves standing alone under the stars, their simple wedding bands catching the moonlight as they held hands and contemplated the future that stretched ahead of them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't issued that challenge?" Evelyn asked, her head resting against Cole's shoulder. "Every day," Cole replied honestly, "but then I remember that the best things in life usually require a leap of faith. You had the courage to leap, and somehow I found the courage to catch you." "We caught each other," Evelyn corrected gently, "and we built something together that's stronger than either of us could have created alone." In the distance, thunder whinnied softly, as if expressing his approval of the conversation. The sound made both of them smile, remembering how this whole adventure had begun, with a challenge involving a horse that no one could ride, and a love that no one thought could survive the obstacles placed in its path. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked. "Now we build the life we've chosen," Cole replied. "Together." The word carried all the promise of their shared future, a ranch to develop, a community to serve, children to raise, and a love to nurture through all the seasons of their lives. They'd learned that true partnership required more than passion. It demanded mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to fight for each other when the world tried to tear them apart. As they walked hand in hand toward their new home, with thunder following behind like a faithful guardian, Cole and Evelyn carried with them the knowledge that they'd proven something important, not just to Iron Creek, but to themselves. Love could indeed conquer all, not through magic or fairy tale endings, but through the daily choice to honor, trust, and protect the person you'd chosen to share your life with. The simple silver wedding bands they wore would tarnish with time and show the wear of years of honest work, but the promises they represented would only grow stronger. In a world where so much was uncertain, Cole and Evelyn had found in each other the one thing that would never fail them, a partnership built on truth, tested by adversity, and blessed by the kind of courage that transforms ordinary people into heroes. The stars above Iron Creek had witnessed many stories over the years, but few as enduring as the tale of a poor cowboy, a brave woman, and a wild horse who taught an entire town that the greatest treasures in life cannot be bought, sold, or stolen. They can only be earned through patience, honored through sacrifice and shared through love.